All right, so in this video, we are still in the middle of the Enlightenment. And we are going to take the entire video today and talk about maybe the most important person involved in the Enlightenment, and that is Voltaire. Voltaire was a pen name. His real name was Francois Marie Arouet. And I'm probably mispronouncing some of that, but Voltaire is what he is known as, and that is what everybody calls him. So we're just going to call him Voltaire, even though that was a pen name that he chose for himself. Voltaire is probably the most prolific writer of all time. He wrote in just about every possible format. So he wrote and published plays and essays and books and novellas and short stories. But he also wrote hundreds, maybe even thousands, tens of thousands of letters. Anything that you could write, Voltaire wrote. His father wanted him to be a lawyer and sent him to school for that, but Voltaire wanted to be a playwright. So he wanted to be a playwright, and that is what he did. And his obvious skill made him very wealthy. So he became a very famous and very wealthy playwright. But it also made him quite a few enemies in absolutist France. So he made a number of enemies in the government. And I should have given you his lifespan, 1694 to 1778. So he's kind of overlapping between Louis the 14th and Louis the 15th. And at the very end of his life, he's also dealing with the early years of Louis the 16th. But anyway, back to the story. Voltaire's skill as a playwright made him wealthy, but he also made a lot of enemies because he's kind of making fun of people in the government. And at one point, he spends 11 months in the Bastille, the infamous French prison, the Bastille, for writing a play that made fun of the king's uncle. We'll spend more time on the Bastille when we get to the French Revolution. If you were wealthy enough, the Bastille was not that bad a place. Because you could pretty much bribe your way into living more or less like you would on the outside. But it's still a prison. I mean, it's not awesome. But we'll talk more about the Bastille later. At one point, when he made more enemies in the government, he is exiled. And he goes to England, where he I guess falls in love with constitutional monarchy and the idea of the English Bill of Rights. And so when he comes back to France, he's going to promote these ideas. And probably make more enemies in the government. Now, if we're thinking about Voltaire's work, his most famous work of all of the things he wrote his most famous book is probably called Candide. That's his most famous book. We'll talk about some of his other ideas in a minute, but Candide is probably the most famous thing that Voltaire wrote. And in Candide, he ridicules everything he hates about French society in a fun adventure story to get people to read it. So Voltaire was really good at kind of hiding his messages in this fun adventure story. So here are some of the things that he makes fun of in Candide. He makes fun of absolute monarchs. He makes fun of the Catholic Church and the Jesuits. In fact, he often ended letters by signing off, "Crush the cursed thing," which is the church. He also made fun of popular philosophies at the time, especially this thing called optimism. Optimism was a popular philosophy of the time, which basically was a religious explanation for why bad things happened. Essentially, the idea is that even if things are bad now, it's the best possible timeline because that's what God wants. That's God's plan. So even if things suck right now, think of how much worse it could be. This is all part of God's plan, is what the idea of optimism says. So this might suck, but think of how bad it could be. That's optimism. Now, Voltaire's biggest contribution to the Enlightenment is his concept or his advocacy, we'll call it that, advocacy for religious toleration. If we had to boil Voltaire's ideas down into one thought, it is religious toleration. Now, Voltaire personally was a deist. And this was a very popular religious idea amongst Enlightenment thinkers. A deist kind of believes in the idea of the absentee watchmaker. And that is what God is. God is an absentee watchmaker. Essentially, God set the universe in motion and left it. He does not intervene in our lives. Maybe a more modern interpretation of this is like a crock pot. You put the food in the crock pot at the beginning of the day and you just let it go. God does not intervene in our lives, and deists do not believe in like the supernatural aspects of religion. So a lot of Enlightenment figures are deists. So most of the people we're going to talk about also believe in this idea of deism. Voltaire is noted for having said, if God did not exist, we would have to invent him. Because the idea for Voltaire is, even though he was a deist, he understood the role of religion in people's lives. Religion provides rules, it provides motivation, it provides a sense of morality. And without religion, Voltaire understood that people need this stuff. They need the rules, they need the motivation, they need the morality that religion provides, even though Voltaire himself didn't believe in that kind of use of religion. It didn't mean anything to him that way, but he understood for society it's needed. So when it comes to religious toleration, though, Voltaire didn't really care what religion you practiced or the government promoted, as long as religion was allowed. As long as any religion was allowed, he didn't care which one you practiced, he didn't care which one the government promoted, as long as some kind of religion, or as long as religion itself was tolerated. So let any religion in, it doesn't matter. And his reasoning was having a lot of religions means no one religion will take over. So let them all in. Let them all in. It's better if they're all in here. One religion by itself will prove tyrannical. Two religions will cause civil war. But having all of the religions available to everyone means that they'll all be weak enough that none of them can take over. Now, with this being said, he hated the Catholics. He was pretty anti-Semitic. And he wrote a lot of anti-Islamic stuff as well. So it seems like he is kind of an all-purpose anti-religious person. He doesn't like religion in general. And specifically, he's not a fan of the Catholics. He's not a fan of Jews. He's not a fan of Muslims. He just doesn't like religion, but he understands the purpose that religion plays in society. It is a necessary evil in the eyes of Voltaire. But even with all of that being said, he took on the case of clearing an executed man's name for allegedly killing his son for converting to Catholicism. Now remember, France is officially Catholic, and so if this guy did kill his son for converting to Catholicism, that would have been a crime worthy of death. But what Voltaire determined was that the man's son killed himself over his gambling debts. And this whole thing is called the Kalei Affair. So the guy was already dead, but Voltaire managed to clear his name so that he could receive payments for from the government for wrongfully killing the man. Now, while all this is going on, you might be wondering, well, what about atheism? So, kind of coming out of this idea, atheism really doesn't exist yet. The idea of deism is about as far as people are willing to go on the whole God doesn't get involved in our lives idea. So atheism isn't really an idea yet. So philosophers at this point still argue that religious morality is essential. So even if you don't believe that God gets involved in your life personally, you still argue that the morality of religion is still important for society. We're not going to get to actual atheism until maybe the 19th century. So we're still quite a bit away from the complete disbelief in God. But we're not really saying that he gets involved in our life either. But we are saying that it's kind of an a-religious morality that religion can provide. Now, there are a few other interesting little tidbits about Voltaire that I would be remiss in not bringing them up. First, for a while, Voltaire and Frederick the Great were roommates. Not necessarily roommates, but Voltaire lived in Prussia at Frederick's palace. And Voltaire had the support of Frederick the Great and his money. So he had his political support and his financial support to write whatever he wanted. And we'll come back to this idea later when we talk about enlightened absolutism. So enlightened absolutism is an absolute monarch that tries to follow enlightened philosophy, that tries to follow the ideas of the Enlightenment. So this is an absolute monarch who tries to impose Enlightenment ideas from the top down, which is kind of weird because a lot of these ideas need to come up from the people, but we're going to give it a try. So Frederick the Great is one of these guys who is an enlightened absolutist, and we'll talk more about him probably towards the end of this series on the Enlightenment. Towards the end of Voltaire's life, he moved to a small village on the French-Swiss border called Fernau. I'm probably mispronouncing that. So it is right on the border with Geneva. And if you remember anything about Geneva, Geneva was the heart of Calvinism. That is where Calvin set up his little theocratic government. And Fernau was a suburb of Geneva on the French side of the border. Now, in Fernau, Voltaire set up playhouses and concert halls for the people of Geneva, because Geneva, being Calvinist, had outlawed most of those things. So Voltaire gave those people an outlet. He said, come to my village, you can see plays, you can listen to music, and then you can go home to your no-fun city. And today, in honor of what Voltaire did, the town is now called Fernau Voltaire. It's named after him in honor of his cultural sponsorship. And he also lived there in case the French authorities ever came after him, he could just slip across the border into Switzerland. Now, Voltaire had perhaps the best set of last words. This is probably apocryphal. He probably didn't say this, but I'm going to tell you anyway because it is a really good set of last words. On his deathbed, Voltaire is offered last rites, which is a ceremony given to people who are dying. It's a Catholic ceremony that you give to people who are about to die. So Voltaire is offered last rites, and part of the last rites involved denouncing the devil. So he would have to denounce Satan as part of the ritual. And Voltaire is said to have said in his last words, now is the wrong time to be making enemies. Because if he's going to be sent to hell, he's not about to go pissing off the devil. Now, there's one other guy in here that I want to kind of just very briefly mention here at the end of this, because he kind of follows the same pattern as Voltaire. He's just not nearly as famous. And this is another French guy, and we're not going to really dwell on him too much, but he's going to kind of follow the same pattern as Voltaire, and his name is Denis Ddero. And he's kind of like, he is very important and influential on his own, but I'm going to kind of think of him as like Voltaire light. He's going to do a lot of the same stuff as Voltaire. He's just not going to be nearly as famous for it. So he is also really prolific. He's a really prolific writer. He's going to get into some trouble. He's going to have an absolute monarch sponsor him. In his case, it's Catherine the Great of Russia. We'll spend some time on Catherine at the same time we talk about Frederick. Diderot's biggest contribution to the Enlightenment is his Encyclopedia. So the Encyclopedia was his attempt to record all human knowledge. That was the point of the Encyclopedia, to record all human knowledge. And he got a lot of Enlightenment thinkers to contribute. But he ended up writing a lot of it himself. We'll come back to Diderot a little bit more when we talk about Catherine, because the relationship between Diderot and Catherine is a little bit more, he's a little bit more tied into her than Voltaire is tied into Frederick. So we'll talk a little bit more about Diderot when we talk about Catherine the Great a few videos from now. Okay, but this guy was the Voltaire, not Diderot. Voltaire was the Enlightenment figure. If anybody encapsulates the Enlightenment, it is definitely Voltaire. So in our next video, we're going to look at some other important Enlightenment figures, and we're going to kind of focus on specific Enlightenment ideas. So the next video will be about ideas of government. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.